Hello everyone, welcome to our channel. Today we are going to learn how to perform stage deployments and canary deployments on Amazon API Gateway. In today's session, I am not going to cover the basics of Amazon API Gateway. However, for the demo, I am going to show you all the step-by-step process, how to create an API gateway and how to update the version of the API gateway. It is going to be a technical hands-on session and we will log into the AWS Management Console. If you want to follow along with me, your AWS usage will be covered by the AWS free tier. If you don't have a free tier account, you can pause the video, quickly create one AWS free tier account and then join me. So buckle up, grab your coffee and notepad and join me for the new session. Before we start, I would like to request you, if you are new to our channel or haven't subscribed yet, then please subscribe to our channel and please click on the bell icon to get notification for any new topics. If you want me to cover any other aspects of API Gateway or any other AWS services, please drop a comment to this video. Now let's first understand the scenario why we need API Gateway stage deployment. API Gateway is a very important AWS service when you are using AWS serverless architecture. In this example, let's say we have an Amazon DynamoDB that is as our database. Then we have one Amazon Lambda. This is for all the backend processing. And we are exposing that service as a REST service via API Gateway. Then you have consumer which is consuming those RESTful APIs. Now you are performing a new deployment where you have upgraded some of the data architecture, maybe some of the inputs and output parameters. Now if you are going to publish the new version or if you are going to overwrite the older version, all the consumer app which is running in previous version, that is V1, will not be able to support this new API version, and that is why it will get error. Now version V1 and V2, it should coexist for some time because you cannot force all the consumers of version 1 to overnight migrate to version 2. They need some time, right? When all the clients will be migrated to new version, that is to V2 in our case, then we don't need V1. But until that time, directly replacing the older version will create disruption in operation. That is why you hear about the term backward compatibility in software deployment. Now, all these deployments, stage deployment, canary deployment, that is to support the backward compatibility and roll back any changes if there is any disaster. Before going to the demo, I would like to explain some common tips regarding Amazon API Gateway. And most of the time, I believe everyone is facing that challenge. The first one is, after modifying any API Gateway changes, do not forget to deploy that change. Multiple times you may encounter a scenario that your changes are not reflecting to the new version. Make sure that you have deployed that change. It is a common mistake. Same applies to Lambda as well. When you are performing any Lambda code changes, not only you will save that change, you have to deploy that change. Then only that change will be reflected in your new Lambda function version. For API Gateway, changes are deployed to stages. That means you can create multiple stages. For our example, we'll create dev, UAT, prod. You can create as many stages as you want. You can apply any name to that API stages. As I was saying, for our demo, we are going to create dev, UAT, stage, prod, but you can use any name you want and that is convenient for your use case. Let's talk about the API stages. When you will have multiple stages, how you are going to reflect or how you are going to invoke the backend Lambda function. That is why API Gateway comes with the concept of stage variables. Each API stages can have its own configuration parameters. For example, dev environment can have its own parameters, whereas production environment can have its own configurations. Then are you going to create different APIs for these regions? The answer is no. We are going to create only one API and we are going to apply those configurations using stage variables. So stage variables, those are like environment variables. We can use them to modify configuration values without redeploying the API. Then we can use the stage variables to pass configuration parameters to AWS Lambda function as well. If your API gateway is connecting with a Lambda function which is serving the backend logic, and if you want to pass any parameter or maybe a query string parameter, then you can use stage variables to pass those parameters to the Lambda function. You can use stage variables to point right Lambda function as well, and we are going to see this in our demo. Stage variables are passed to context object of the AWS Lambda variable, and we'll discuss this part in our demo today. But one important point, while we are providing the stage variable, we have to remember this format, that you have to mention $, then curly braces, stage variables where V is capital, and then the variable name. Now this variable name, you can choose whatever the variable name you want, but this part you should remember. This is the format you should use while you are using the stage variables, and we will see that in our demo today. But before that, let's see the use cases. As I mentioned, you can use stage variables to select or point to different Lambda functions, or you can use for different HTTP endpoints, or even for parameter mapping templates. Now for today's demo, we are going to talk about this use case. Let's say we have a dev stage, and then we'll have a dev alias, the Lambda alias, and that dev Lambda alias is pointing the latest version. That is how we are doing in our daily life, right? The first changes that we are applying to the dev region, that is why it will always have the latest version. Then we are going to test that changes. When all the changes are satisfying the requirement, then we are going to push that change to the test region, maybe to the UAT region, and then we are going to take that to production. Now if I'll see the chronological order, production will have the oldest version, then the test, and the dev will always have the latest version. Now if you want to understand what is Lambda alias, what is Lambda version, I will touch a little, but if you want me to create a dedicated video, please drop your request as a comment to this video. For this use case, we are going to create another one stage or API stage that will be UAT. You can name as you want. It will point to the UAT alias, and which is going to point to the Lambda version 2. And 100% of the traffic that will go to that particular Lambda version. Now, when you are going to deploy any production, previous to the deployment version or the deployment API stage will always point to the prod alias of the Lambda function or the production version of the Lambda function. Now before the deployment, now if we want to test the new code or new function using production traffic, we can use a blue-green deployment. We can pass the 90% traffic to the original Lambda function or the production Lambda function, and we can pass 10% of the traffic to the newer version. If we see that this Lambda is working as expected, then we can promote that Lambda changes and we can pass the entire traffic, that is 100%, to the production Lambda function or the new version. That is why we are only changing the Lambda aliases and we are not changing the API. And that is the beauty of API stage deployment. We are decoupling the implementation with the REST definition. Now for today's demo, what we are going to do, first we are going to create a Lambda function. We are going to create 3 different Lambda versions. As I told, V1 for the production, V2 for the UAT, and latest it will be for the dev. Then we are going to create 3 lambda aliases to point these 3 versions, one for dev, one for UAT, and one for prod. After that, we are going to create an API gateway, and we are going to create 3 API stages, one dev, one UAT, and one prod. And then we will map each API stages with the corresponding lambda functions. Now, when we are going to test, we are going to invoke the same API URL. We are going to pass the stage variable, and we are going to invoke the different lambda function for today's demo. Now it's demo time. Let's log in to AWS Management Console. I have logged into AWS Management Console and I am at console home. If you have used Amazon API Gateway, you will see Amazon API Gateway in recently visited services, or else you can go to search bar and type API and select API Gateway. Now if you remember that we would like to create that backend service as well. So let's create the lambda function first, and then we'll create the API gateway, because when we'll create the API definition, that time you need a backend. Let's go to lambda. The way we have typed API gateway, I'll type lambda in the search bar and then I'll open lambda. If you are using lambda for the first time, like for this demo account, I haven't created any lambda function. You will see a create function button at the top of the screen. Click that button. Now provide any lambda function name you want. I am going to use the name API underscore gateway underscore integration underscore lambda. As I mentioned, you can use any name. Now from runtime, we are going to select Python 3.12, and we'll keep the architecture as is. Then we'll click create function. Now for the source code, I'm going to add a small code fragment here, and we are just trying to pass the status message and some body. This is a simple code I have added. So first I am printing the event. What is the event that is coming in Lambda handler? Then I have a message body. We are going to modify that message body. We are passing the status code as 200, and then we are returning a header with a context type application/JSON. That means we are sending that response which will be in a JSON format, and we are sending the status code and message body. It is a simple lambda function. Now we are going to test that change. I'll give an event name. You can give what name you want. I'll save and then I'll test. You will get a response like this, where header will be content type application/JSON, status code 200, and the message body, it is saying sample response from API integration lambda function. Now since we have the lambda function created, I'll copy the lambda ARN and I'll go back to API gateway and I'll create the API. As of today, Amazon API Gateway supports HTTP API, WebSocket API, and then REST API in two formats. One is public and one is private. I'll click the build. Now there are different options. Either you can create the API or you can import the API from an open API definition. If you already have an existing API, you can clone that API, or you can use the example API template for this one. But we are going to create a new API. Now for the API name, we are going to use Cloud Expert Solution API Demo. I'll keep the description as optional. For API endpoint type, there are three options. One is regional, that is bound to a particular region. Then edge optimized. Edge optimized means it will use the edge region of AWS global infrastructure, and it can go to multiple other regions, and the other option is private. For this demo, we are going to select regional and then create API. Now the first step, we have to create a method. Here the method type, you can select any variable. We'll create a get, and then as backend type or integration type, as I was saying, You can either have a Lambda function or a HTTP endpoint or a mock where you do not have any backend. You are just simply sending a response, or any AWS service if you want to use. Now you can select whatever the API, whatever the AWS region you are. I am in UST2, and then whatever the AWS service you want, maybe you want Athena and you want to expose that service using a REST API, you will be able to do that. For our demo, we are going to create the Lambda function, and in the Lambda function ARN, we are going to copy that Lambda ARN and then create method. Now we have the get method. We can go and test that function. We can click test, and here you go. As we were getting in the actual Lambda response, here also we are getting the header. The content type is application/JSON, status code 200, and message body, sample response from API integration Lambda function. So the first part is already done. We have created a Lambda function, and we have created the REST API, and we have integrated the Lambda function. In your actual use case, you are not going to test this API using this API gateway console. You are going to invoke from some API tool or from the browser. That is why the next stage would be we have to deploy that API. Before deploying that API, let me bring my PPT again. We are going to create the Lambda versions, then we will create the Lambda aliases, and then we will deploy the API into different stages. So let's create those Lambda versions first. Navigating back to Lambda console, we have the Lambda function. Now let's modify the message a little. We are going to attach with alias UAT, and version will be v1. Now I am going to save these changes and then deploy the change. Then we are going to test the change. Here you go. We can see that the message updated successfully. We'll go back to the Lambda code, and then from the action drop down, we are going to publish this version. As I was mentioning, we are going to create v1 or the version 1 for this. Now version 1 is published. Then we are going to again modify this, and this time we are going to invoke from production. That is where you are going to update. Sorry, we have to go to the Lambda function, not the particular version. Now from here, we are going to create prod and maybe version v2. We'll save the change, we'll deploy and test. Yes, alias prod and version v2. Now again, we'll go to action, publish version, and this will be my v2 version. I'll publish. If I'll go back to my Lambda function, and if I'll go to the version, there I'll see that I have currently two versions, version 2 and version 1. Now let's create the Lambda aliases first. Again, for this I'll go to action, create alias. Alias name I'll use dev. From the version, I'm going to select the latest. If you remember, description, it is optional. You can give. Now there is another one feature that you can weighted alias. Maybe if you want a percentage of the traffic, if you remember that in our diagram, 90% of the traffic will go to older version and 10% of the traffic will come to newer version. If you want that kind of setup, you can create here in the weighted alias section. I'll save. So I have one alias created, which is dev and which is pointing to latest. Now if I'll again go back to my Lambda function in the version, if I'll go to version 1, version 1 code is saying it is the alias is UAT and version v1. I'm going to create alias. This time I'll provide the name as UAT. Version is v1. I'll give a description and then I'll save. One last Lambda alias I have to create. I'll go back to the main function, create alias, and then I'll give the alias name as prod, description, and I'll attach with the version v2. Now I have created 3 different Lambda aliases. I'll again go to the Lambda and I'll copy the ARN. Now this time what I'm going to do, I'm going to deploy that API into different stages. I'll deploy. I'll select a stage. Now I do not have a stage, so that is why I'm going to create a stage, and this time I'll give the stage name as dev, and done. We are going to follow the same process multiple times for our next part of the demo. That is when you are going to deploy multiple stages of the API gateway and linked with different Lambda versions. Now let's create a new method. Maybe I'll create a resource and I am going to provide the resource name as stage deployment demo. Under the stage deployment demo, I am going to create the method. Again, my method will be get. I am going to use the Lambda function and it will be a proxy integration. I am going to paste the Lambda alias. Now, if you remember, I told you have to use one particular syntax, that is colon, then curly braces, stage variables with s, then dot. I am going to use my variable name as Lambda alias, and I am going to create the method. Now the moment I'll add that variable, it is saying you defined your Lambda function as a stage variable. Run the following AWS CLI command to ensure you have appropriate policy. I'll go to add permission and then I'm going to copy this particular part. And I'm going to open Cloud Shell and there I'm going to execute that command. But one part I would like to show you. Let me open a notepad. I'm going to paste that command, and if you see AWS Lambda add permission function name, the ARN part is correct. Now instead of that Lambda alias, this variable, we have to put dev, prod and UAT. Instead of the stage variable, we'll first run with dev. Now we are going to copy this command and we are going to execute in Cloud Shell. Okay, so we have successfully executed for dev. Now we are going to do the same thing for other Lambda aliases. Let me quickly execute for test and prod as well. Okay, there was an additional dollar value which is causing that issue. Maybe we'll go and we'll fix this syntax. And by the way, I'm not going to delete this part of the video such that you will be able to debug if you are facing similar issue. So this dollar sign, it was additional. Yeah, now it executed successfully. Next, you are going to replace the UAT with prod or dev with prod, and you are going to execute again. I'll make sure that I do not have any spelling mistakes. I'll execute. Yes. So the execution is successful. We do not need Cloud Shell anymore. Now, before creating the method, I'd like to drag your attention to the default timeout of API gateway. You know that Lambda has a timeout of 15 minutes and you can set timeout up to 15 minutes. But when you are integrating Lambda function with API gateway has a default timeout of 29 seconds and that is the maximum. If your backend Lambda function is not responding within 29 seconds, then API gateway will throw a timeout exception. You can set the timeout value between 50 milliseconds to 29,000 milliseconds, which is 29 seconds. For our use case, we'll go with the default timeout and we'll create the method. Now let's test this integration. We'll go to test and in the Lambda alias, we'll put prod. Here you go. It is coming from alias prod version 2. If we'll change to UAT, it is coming from alias UAT version v1, and then we are going to put as dev. Here it is coming, although I have put dev, it is coming from the prod. Maybe I have did some misconfiguration. Let's go ahead and fix that. I'll go to Lambda integration and I'll go to code and the Lambda function. Yes, the latest version is saying Lambda alias prod version v2. So this is the latest version. It should be dev and version is latest. Let's save and deploy. Then let's go back to the API gateway and let's test again. Here you go. Now it is coming from dev and latest. If I'll change it to prod, it should come from prod alias version v2. If I test with UAT, it should come from UAT version v1. Now every time you are not going to test using this API console, that is why you have to deploy. Now let's go ahead and deploy the API into different stages. We will start with the dev stage. We do not have a stage, so we'll create a dev stage. We do not need a description. And now, since we have deployed that into a different stage, now let me show you where you are going to add the stage variable. If you come at the bottom of the screen, there is the stage variables. Now you have to go to edit, add stage variable. From here, give the variable name. We have used Lambda alias and the value as dev. And you are going to save the stage variable. Similarly, you are going to create other stages. I'll deploy API, and in this case, I'll go to a new stage. This time I'll put UAT. And again in the stage variable, I'll add the stage variable name as. I'll repeat the same process for prod as well. We have created all the API stages. Now let's test. Maybe I'll select the prod stage. I'll copy the URL. I'll paste into browser and then stage deployment demo. Here you go. The response is coming from Lambda function alias prod version v2. Now if you will change it to UAT, this is coming from UAT. If I'll change it to dev, it will come from dev. Now you can understand with the help of the stage variable, we can control which Lambda function or the which backend code it is going to invoke. And this is the beauty of stage deployment. We'll move to our second part, which is Lambda Canary Deployment. Let's try to understand what is Canary Deployment. Then we'll come to the demo part. In a short form, if I'll try to explain what is Canary, Canary is a deployment option where you can test changes using production traffic. Now let's try to understand how it works with a simple diagram. Let's say this is your production stage. This is your production Lambda alias and the version v1. Now what you are trying to do, you are trying to deploy a new version in the production. Now instead of directly deploying that function into production, you create a canary stage, and in that canary stage, you can distribute the traffic. Maybe for the first 10 minutes, you can put only 5% of the total traffic. If the function is working properly, then after 5 minutes, you can transfer the entire traffic to the new method and discard the old method. So this is called canary. Here you have different options. You can choose percentage of the traffic that the Canary channel will receive. You can create maybe 5% for 5 minutes, 5% for 10 minutes, and then after 10 minutes the entire traffic will be transferred to the new version. Now let's see the Canary deployment option in action. Again, I am back to my AWS management console. This time I'll create a new Lambda function and I'll give the name as Lambda Canary demo. I'll choose the runtime as Python 3.12. I'll create the function. Why I'm not using my previous function? Because it has 3 aliases. I would like to show you a different message this time. That is why I'm just creating a new Lambda function. But if you want to use the previous function, feel free to do that one. Now I'll go to my previous function. I'll copy the code and I'll paste into my new Lambda function, the Canary demo. And I am going to update this message body version v1. Maybe this is my prod alias. I'll save, I'll deploy, I'll test. Okay, this is coming from version v1 prod alias. I'll go back to my code and then publish new version. This will be my version v1. I have created the version and now I am going to create an alias. Maybe this will be my prod alias and version is v1. Again, I'll go back to my code. This time I am going to change my code to version v2 and this is, let's say, UAT alias. I'll save, deploy, test. This is coming properly. I'll create a new version. This will be my v2. I'm going to create a new alias. Okay, I'll go to Lambda, create alias. This time I'm going to put UAT and I'm going to select the v2. To summarize, I have created a new Lambda function. I have created two versions, v1 and v2, and I have created two alias. Version v1 is prod, version v2 is UAT. Now let's go back to API gateway. I'll go to resources. I'm going to create a new resource and I'm going to name as Canary Demo API. Now inside that I'm going to create a method and again this will be a get Lambda function. Now I'm going to choose the Lambda Canary demo and this time instead of using that stage variables I'm going to use the version number. So if I want to use v1, that is my production, that is where I am going to use number 1 instead of v1 and then I'm going to create the method. Okay, my method has been created. If I'll go and if I'm going to test it, it should send from the Canary v1 production alias. So this is coming properly. I'm going to deploy the API. I'm going to go back to resources and I'm going to deploy the API to a new stage which I'm going to call as Canary. Now as I was saying, during the Canary deployment, what you can do, you can distribute the traffic. So I have the Canary stage. Now I can go to Canary tab and I can create a Canary. You can see the current stage and the Canary stage. For my case, current stage is v1. It is getting 100% traffic. That is why if I'll go back to my stage and if I'll try to invoke that URL, I'll take the resource name Canary Demo API. Okay. Now I'm getting from v1 prod alias. Now what I'm going to do, if I'll refresh, I'll always get from v1 because I have only one version and 100% is coming from the current version. Now I'm going to change this setting. I'll go to Canary and I'm going to create a Canary. Now, normally for Canary, what you are going to do, you are going to pass maybe 5% or 10%, a very small amount of traffic in your actual production cases. But for this demo, I am going to use 50% of the traffic. So 50% will go to Canary stage and 50% will go to current stage. And I am going to create the Canary. Now if I'll go, you can see here the Canary setting. 50% will go to the current state and 50% will go to the Canary stage. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to again go back to my resource. I'm going to modify the integration request. This time instead of v1, I'm going to use as 2, and then I'm going to save the changes. I'll go back to the resource, I'll deploy, and again I'll deploy to Canary. Now if I'll go back to my URL, here you go. Now you can see that it is coming from v2. You may see that it may take 1 to 2 minutes to refresh. Now since I have the 50-50, it will once coming from v1 and then it will again come from v2. This is the beauty of Canary deployment. And now once everything is working properly, then what you can do, you can again switch everything to the current deployment or everything to the new deployment if everything is working fine. And by this way, you will be able to test your new version with a small portion of actual production traffic. Thank you for joining me today. I hope today's video was helpful and you enjoyed. If you found this content helpful, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more in-depth discussion on AWS and other cutting-edge technologies. Feel free to leave comments below with any questions or topics you would like to see covered in future videos. Thank you again for your time and engagement. Until next time, happy cloud computing and take care.